class, and they had just released Mosaic at U of I, which was sort of just down the road. And I was taking a class. Remember how excited the professor was to show it to us, and I really sort of leapt into that. And I started making websites about literature, and I actually got hired by an early .com to do a website about contemporary literature. This what was the mining company when it became about.com. So I was doing that, and then a group of friends and I, who often wrote together, sort of played writing games together, got together one weekend, and I had just written a thing about hypertext fiction, which I just researched a bit for that article. And we decided to put out, we were talking about how hard it is to get these sort of strange experimental writing things published. So we decided we would just publish an anthology of our own work. And we said, well, we can do that, but we don't have that material with us. What should we do this weekend? So we came upon the idea of writing a hypertext novel about the book tour that we would go on after we published the book as a sort of publicity stunt. That sort of took over, and it was really exciting because we were writing together, and we began this unknown hypertext novel, and then essentially kept writing it for about 3 years. And that won an award that was judged by the novelist Robert Coover in 1999. And this, just to tell you about my path, which is kind of a strange, wavy path. So he invited us out to Brown for this conference that was, it was a gathering of technologists and writers called Technology Platforms for 21st Century Literature. And it was very strange because it was these early sort of .com. I'm just going to turn this on the screen. Oh no, that's my kids wanting to sit back. So while we were there, there were sort of people talking about how they were going to quickly make a unicorn, or the equivalent of a unicorn back then. And then there were these writers working this obscure literary form that nobody knew about, these experimental writers. So the two groups didn't really mesh terribly well. But then at the banquet, I was sitting next to Coover and Jeff Ballou, who was basically kind of venture capitalist. And he was like, well, Scott, how do you think these groups could benefit from each other? And I said, well, there's nonprofit organizations for things like poetry or small magazines and presses, and and I think if you guys need content and you're interested in developing interesting material for the web, which they were at one point for things in the 90s, they were thinking about how they could publish in that sort of model. So you guys have money, and these people don't have money, and they need resources, and you have resources, and you need ideas, so you should put together some kind of a consortium or a nonprofit. And Jeff said, well, if you write up a business plan, I'll help you to try and find money to start it. So I was supposed to be working on my dissertation, but I wrote a business plan with him, and we actually got this nonprofit, the Electronic Literature Organization, started. And then I took some time off my dissertation and ran that for a few years as executive director. And then I served on the board for 15 years after that. Then after the internet collapse, which was shortly after that, the first collapse, that money had sort of gone away, but we got some funding from the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and we hosted it first at UCLA. So we moved it into an academic context, and then it's moved around to different institutions ever since. And it's still sort of really central to this field of electronic literature. So I taught for New Jersey in a few years. I got hired to start a new media studies program, track in a literature program. And then I moved to Norway about 11 years ago where they have, at the time it was called humanistic informatics, but we changed it to digital culture about 7 years ago. So that's just a quick introduction to my background. I want to show you some films, so I don't want to go on forever, but just really quickly to give you an idea of what I mean by combinatory digital poetics. And really what I'm talking about is poetry generators, or poetry recombination systems, and then how Roderick, Coover, and I, actually Bob's son, a good friend of mine, who's a filmmaker, have been working together for the last, I guess, 5 or 6 years on some film projects, some of which use these techniques from poetry generation.
Is that Coover with a K-L-U?
Coover, C-O-O-V-E-R. Yeah. Rod's he's a professor of film and media studies at Temple University. All right, so where this comes from in terms of sort of poetics, most of you will probably be familiar with the things I'm going to just run through real quickly here. But aleatory, sort of from, aeolus, is sort of the wind blowing through things, appearing at random. This is a kind of poetic that's been explored for a long time, starting with the Dada and Tristan Tzara's famous statement of how to become a famous poet, essentially. Take a newspaper, take a pair of scissors, cut out an article of the length that you wish to give your poem, cut out all the words, put them in a bag, shake gently, and then remove each cutting one after the other in the order which they emerge from the bag. Copy conscientiously. The poem will be like you. You will now become an infinitely original writer with a charming sensitivity, although still misunderstood by the common people. And of course, the Dada were sort of trying to shock and disturb in a variety of ways because they felt that language had been corrupted, and they were sort of reacting to World War I era nationalism. So one of the things that they wanted to do was overturn all of our expectations of language. But it's interesting if you actually follow this algorithm and do it with a newspaper article of the day, you end up with some interesting material that's more poetic than the newspaper article that you actually started with, because it does do this sort of act of defamiliarization on the news of the day and resituates it, makes its strangeness available to you. Of course, surrealist writing games or art games are another sort of inspiration for this kind of work. These are just some illustrations of one of these sorts of games where you make a drawing, you leave a few lines exposed, you pass it to the next artist, they fill in the drawing, and so on with 4 iterations. People also do this, and the surrealists did this with poetry. Their idea was that they were trying to access some kind of collective unconscious or the unconscious. They were sort of very mystical about these sort of things. But it is a sort of constraint that brings in interesting collaborative effects. I won't read this quote to you by William S. Burroughs, who is doing cut-ups, but just to highlight one thing here. So he did this. You're probably familiar with the novel Naked Lunch, which was essentially a cut-up novel. He also actually worked with Brian Geisen on audio recordings, compositions that were spliced up, sometimes intentionally, sometimes at random. But the idea is that all writing, in some ways, is an accident of spontaneity. But you didn't necessarily have a way to introduce this until you introduced something like a cut-up technique that, again, sort of algorithmically introduces randomness that might become inspiration. Another group or movement that explores recombination in a variety of different ways is the Oulipo, which is a group of French writers and mathematicians who get together and have dinner in Paris once a month, and they still do this. And at those dinners, they both present work that they've had, that that they've done, and also they present each other with challenges. So the mathematicians say, you should write a novel according to this particular formula or algorithm. This is Raymond Queneau's 100,000 Billion Poems, which is a sonnet on 10 pages, except that instead of cut pages, you have cut lines, and it works as a sonnet no matter how you vary it. So 10 to the 14th power, you have 100,000 billion poems. And here he said something interesting about constraints that I think is really important. In digital writing, we often think about constraints. But he says that that one of the things that happens when you have these absurd rules that you must never forget is that they keep you too busy to worry about being reasonable, so that you don't become obsessed with some of the basic things, for instance, what they might think about when writing a poem or a novel, because you're thinking about, for example, writing without using the letter E. And I use that example because, I talked to him once, and he told me about this. George Perec, his novel Desperation, or Avoid in English, he wrote it without using the letter E, which is very difficult. But it was actually a novel in which he was trying to write about the disappearance of his parents, or the abduction, killing of his parents during the Holocaust. And it was a subject that he couldn't approach if he just set out to do it straight. But he was able to access it and to write a novel that reads very well in spite of the constraint, as a result of having this present. That's just an example of a snowball, very simple constraint. Each line has one letter more than the last, but there's very many of these, and it's a lot of fun to look at the Oulipo books. The Oulipo Compendium, actually, Harry Matthews edited, if you want to entertain yourself with some different artistic activities and challenges. It's a lot of fun to look through the different poems they've come up with. So text generation and combinatory poetics is the first form of digital writing, actually. It's the one that stretches back the furthest. So it's essentially processes of producing text by manipulating natural language with algorithms. The first one, Christopher Strachey's Love Letters. Christopher Strachey, this is in 1952. Not brilliant writing necessarily, but Christopher Strachey was he was a friend of Alan Turing's, and also sort of rumored to be a lover of Alan Turing's, which is interesting in the context of this work. Very simple text generator that produces absurd love letters. Right? Some people have done some interesting research on this piece. Duck, duck, you are my little, not this piece, but the generator. You are my little affection, my beautiful appetite, my eager hunger, my covetous love, lust for your infatuation. My yearning anxiously clings to your fellow feeling. Oh, yours eagerly, MUC. And MUC is Manchester University Computer. But it's this sort of, not quite, this sort of kind of uncanny, not quite human sounding language. But some people have actually suggested that one of the things that he was doing was parroting heterosexual courtship rituals, because at the time, of course, homosexuality was you know what happened to Alan Turing. There was a great deal of oppression. This is in 1959 a stochastic text generator by Theo Lutz. And interestingly, a lot of these examples, Christopher Strachey was a computer programmer. Theo Lutz was essentially a linguist. They were just exploring how they could produce text on a computer. But some of the texts are actually interesting. Not every look is near, no village is great. A castle is free and every farmer is far. Every stranger is far, a day is late. Every house is dark, and eye is deep. Not every castle is old, every day is old. Not every guest is angry, a church is narrow. No house is open, and not every church is silent. Not every eye is angry, no look is new. Sounds...
You feel the algorithm in that.
yeah. But it does sound like an intended poem in a way,
Yeah,
right? Part of it is the corpus that he was actually using, is titles from Kafka novels and short stories. The first sort of intentional poetry generator, or probably the first one, was by Alison Knowles, a Fluxus writer, collaborating with composer James Tenney, who had done a residency at Bell Labs in the 1960s. And they basically set out to produce a program that would produce a form of poetry. So it creates these very simple stanzas. A house of glass in southern France, using candles, inhabited by very tall people. A house of tin on the sea, using candles, inhabited by Negroes wearing all colors. A house of mud inside a mountain, using candles, and so forth. The interesting thing about this project, well, obviously it's the fact that it's one of the original generators is interesting, but they, as the Fluxus sort of did, they used this for other things. So one of the things they did with it was produce one of these stanzas, or a few of these stanzas, and then build structures. So they actually built architectural structures based on the output of the poem. First in New York, and then they actually transported one of them by truck to Cal Arts. And then it became a performance stage for a number of happenings, including a poem drop, which they hired a helicopter. I don't know why I like this, because it's completely absurd. But they got a helicopter, and then they had reams and reams of these dot matrix printer versions of the poem, and they dropped the poem from the helicopter to people below, distributing poetry to the people. So there's still a lot of work being done with poetry generation. My friend Nick Montfort is sort of one of the big advocates of this sort of work. And he does, he's very much about the computational principle of elegance. So creating computer code that using very, very little code produces text. So all of these actually produce text, and some of them what you might call poetry. But he's done a ton of these 256 character poetry generators. So for him, this is a kind of conceptual writing. Sometimes the texts produced are interesting. Sometimes they're much like visual poetry. But a lot of them do produce, coherent texts, whether they're very appealing or not. It's sort of a matter of opinion. Let me show you this. This projector's pretty good. Let me bump up here. Because the reason I like this project is something else. Did the internet? Okay, but to really quickly give you an idea what this is, because when we get to the films. Maybe, does Edgero not work here? I'll go back to mine. Oh, there
It looks like it's back
There you
now.
go. Okay. All right. Miss range the basins, ripplings hold. Shape sweeps the ripplings, direct the sinuous Forests sweep the flows, veins rest, shapes linger, layers pace the flows, translate the fine, objective, arch, dim, brows exercise the stones, ripplings linger, layers relax, forest roams the cove, enter the encompassing, straight, clear driven, heights range the stones, layers dream, veins linger, monkeys exercise the rippling. So this is a poetry generator just in JavaScript that we wrote about a national park in Taiwan. So when I saw this, I liked the project. I liked the inversion that it's a this sort of computer program that produces nature poetry. But Nick and I are pretty close friends, and we've done a lot of writing together over the years. And so, sort of as a joke, originally, what I did is I took Nick's source code.
There it is.
So I took Nick's source code and changed the vocabulary, changed a few other minor details of it, and then posted it, a new version on the web, and then sent Nick a link in an email and said, "Hey, look, Nick, I've improved your poem." And this is Tokyo Garage. Samurai smell the routine, flower arrangements sing, Jesus freak arranges the freaks. Forgo the troubling, unyielding, robust, Jesus freaks reorient the subjects, zombies profile the gaijin. Curse the strangely quiet, multitudinous, private dicks dream the politicians, tourists win, bicycle messengers trail the hit cats. Forgo the sated, inhospitable alien, puppeteer fondles the kids, subways succeed, host twist, tourists love the processor, signify the mysterious scantily clad, prostitute rearranges the fund, rats destroy, altours fall, saxophonists pick the pink kittens, bless the epic, cultists unsettle the funds, watchers destroy, earthquakes drain the embezzler, translate the lithe, awkwardly familiar, dawn gropes the bureaucrats, shogun warriors preserve the fund, script the infantile, banal, translucent, rat scolds the subject, strangers fail, scholars shake the vintage Cadillacs, explore the cacophonous, all-absorbing, and so on. So the interesting thing was I took Taroko Gorge, made it Tokyo Garage, took a minimalist poem and turned poem system and turned it into a maximalist one, and tried to take what was about nature and turn it into this sort of cacophonous, cosmopolitan poem about an imaginary city, or the idea of the city. So more interesting than that, though, is I had just put this online. Some other people saw it, and actually Nick wrote something about it, I think. But what happened subsequently is one of these sort of wonderful electronic literature stories, in that another writer, J.R. Carpenter, who does a lot of work in electronic literature, Talon Mehmet, a number of other people decided to do the same thing. And this established a kind of convention or genre. J.R. Carpenter wrote a version of it called Gorge, about eating and digestion. Talon Mehmet wrote one called Toy Garbage, about sort of plastic culture and different forms of garbage toys.
Could you reload one of these to demonstrate how the second time it's different, if you don't mind?
Just reload the...
Anyone, because it's so fascinating how they...
Oh, yes. So it actually has a structure. That the structure will be the same on each run, but the language will be completely different. So that the sort of, it has a grammar, and then it basically slots the elements in from the grammar. I'll show you that really quickly. All right, so here's the source code, and this is most of it actually. It's a pretty simple program. From Nick's, from the original one, Taroko Gorge. And you can see where the language comes in. There's certain things that go above, certain things below, transitive, intransitive, verbs, and so forth. So it's basically parts of speech that are kind of slotted into the program. And then when I took the code, I sort of exploded the vocabulary quite a bit. And then I changed a few other minor things, but I was basically using the same code base. So the reason why I love this work, obviously this happened and there was this sort of weird kind of phenomenon. A bunch of people made it. Now people have written about it in dissertations and stuff. But also it's been wonderful for me because, I came from fiction writing, from creative writing, and a lot of my friends are just plain old writers. And they would often say to me, well, electronic literature is really interesting, but I can't do any code. I couldn't possibly do anything with that. And this is something where we can just sit down and I can say, if you can write a list of verbs and you can write a list of nouns, you can create a completely different version of a poetry generator in a matter of hours, right? It does take, I did end up spending more time with this than I intended to, just because, I started adding words and changing them and watching it and then seeing what would work and what wouldn't work, lines that sort of break the lines in different ways, and had a lot of fun with it. I was going to talk about frequency, which maybe I'll do just really quick. This is a more sort of, this is one that I wrote on my own, a kind of constrained writing project that I was sort of writing in a way to learn how to program. So I thought I'd do a poetry generator, but it was part of this sort of strange, obsessive, constrained writing project where I took the 200 most used words in the English language and then wrote 2,000 lines of poetry only using those words and with sets of 10 beginning with each word. And now, the 200 most used words in the English language are not the most expressive words in the English language, so that was a sort of challenging thing in itself. But what the program does is reassemble them into different forms. So it assembles a poem. So do you want the poem to rhyme?
Yes.
See, that's everybody says that, and it's really a bad idea if you really think about it. So do you want, what do you want? Petrarchan, Shakespearean, Tears of Rima,
Spencer.
Okay, and I'm warning you, all that this is going to do is give you the rhyme scheme, which is particularly bad because of the fact that there's only so many words that rhyme. Off to try again, be at one with the land, large and by. On her need he would try his kind hand. I can only try to ask why. One could show the way, year that we would try. Us we will not say, the old man, a boy at play. Point me there, time has a way. Point me there, another time will come for you, a way for you too. No. Okay. All right. So this is
normal poem. What's a normal poem?
Okay, you want a normal poem? I can't even remember what was normal. I think it's okay. His house is not a. I think it doesn't rhyme or have any. I think it actually generates a number of lines and it doesn't rhyme. His house is not a home. Were my people there? Them people use too much air. Well, call me before you go. Give that animal a home. Spell it out. Was men who made us part. Would you know the answer? Number them all the same. Me, I only want you. Form a new sound. Then another now. Place of great change. Know why we came. Time will show you. All right, let's get into some of the more interesting things. A couple more choices here.
Snowball.
Snowball, great. Okay, and we'll go by character. Would the answer change you? Put in, go away, be a man. Found out, big answer, big boy now. Some ask why, water it down. Many do little. Answer the call, number them down. Because I need it, line was just that. What have you found? Again, the word is no. to want to meet again. All went away from him. Part of what we do here, being over and back again, but I still want an answer, over the need for an answer, because I could not find it. Our house is not in good form. By and large, it was a good day. May you live to see another day. Right or just, all the same to me. It could turn out to be different, and the end may not change a thing. For our people, we found little here. Had the before not been so wrong, a different world must follow our own. A just people would make another world. America will be over before you know it. They should answer for what their men do. Read on and see if an answer can be found. Go find the place where the world
That's
May you do that again?
You want to do it again?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Let us know.
All right. You're going to find that some of the lines will be in the same position, because they might be the only lines that have 22 characters right now. So I don't know if I'm going to read the whole thing, but if you want to look at it, it's different.
The last line is similar, huh?
The last line is going to be the same. So that was put in, go away. This is put in, give up, be a man, hand out, show them, big answer, out of form, made to move, write it home, see it through. My answer is no. Through with you. These are on hand, not for us to know. Long to be with you, letter was very mean. Learn to live it down. There is a still place. Most would just give up. Which word did you write after you were well again? Can you make me well again? Which answer made you still? Word before sentence or page, different world than your own, because your answer will not do. Word to give what you think. Form long before we came to each other. Great well, this is all we have now. We could come for the water or air. By the end, we could learn the answer, or it could have been before our time. America came and took your mother away. Your man could not say what he could see. They should answer for what their men do. Then you can show me what you are made of. Go find the place where the world will end. We might always be finding the place where the world will end.
That's a great last line, you should keep it.
And let me just show you really quickly, I won't read these, but I just want to show you a couple more, because once I figured out how to do the snowball thing, and because these are sort of fixed with fonts, I sort of played with various other forms that I just sort of made up. So here's four square, which becomes a kind of sort of concrete form. And I really like this two tones. So, and those will produce very variable. So anyway, I think, you know, it actually ends up producing some interesting poetry, which sort of was my goal. Now, part of that is that the lines were all sort of handwritten, whereas in the PPG 256 things, the lines are put together on the fly. So each of the 2,000 lines is intended. What the program does is rearrange it. Okay, now getting into how this changes when we get into film. Rod and I and Nick as well talked about how we could sort of transfer this way of recombining elements to films from poetry generation. So you'll see, actually I shouldn't kill that. So you'll see some patterns.
Before you move on, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
Have you, so you know how in a lot of literary digital humanities we discern grammatical patterns in a body of work, whether it's by author or by genre, etc. Have you ever kind of looked at the results of that grammatic pattern and then regenerate it. Is that kind of
Oh,
what you
yeah.
did in the last?
And then rewritten it, or?
Right.
Yeah. So an interesting thing with both these film projects especially, is that they've, it's sort of like with The Unknown, the first project I ever did, it was the same sort of thing where with digital materials you can put them out and keep rewriting and adapting them over time. Right? So this is something that we certainly do with all of our projects, and with a database film, or poetry generating, that's essentially part of the process, is rewriting. So with the two films that I'm going to show, we put these out, and we showed them at festivals and so forth, but then we talked about kind of what worked and what didn't, and both of them we also expanded quite a bit, because of their database structure you can kind of, it's not like a fixed cut of a film where you're sort of done with it. You can move in new elements, and certainly with the films, because we use, in these we mainly used voice actors, we were able to say, well, like, actually that actor didn't work. We'll just totally re-record that, put in a new one. But also do completely different version. It's sort of like restructuring a poem, right? So you can structurally change the algorithm slightly and change the structure. So I'm just going to show you this really quickly, how this works. I won't go through the whole diagram, but it's actually a pretty simple computer program. The first one is going to make these very short films. The way that this project came about, Rod sent Nick and I each a basket of images, of still and moving images, short still and moving images, and each of them reacted differently to them in terms of writing. I started sort of putting these into thematic buckets and writing short narratives in response to them. Nick actually took some of the images and created a form, or used the form that Harry Matthews called perverbs, which is two proverbs sort of broken and then put back together, which often creates kind of funny outcomes. And then we decided, well, what could we do with these two different things together? We decided to use Nick's perverbs as morals to the stories that I was creating. And then subsequently, we made it so that it actually doesn't repeat until about 45 minutes, so it can actually work as a whole film as well. And there is a sort of narrative to it that unfolds over it. I'll run just a few cycles of this because I do want to see Toxi City in more detail.
I don't believe in fate, no. But I don't really think that I'm the master of my own destiny. So many things have happened that I wouldn't have anticipated. I guess I think there's an invisible hand of some kind. A finger that flicks an avalanche or claps an earthquake into being. I don't think it's God, really. It's some force that's beyond me. I don't feel like I'm the master of my own destiny. That's for sure. They carve away the mountain. A mountain is not so much, nothing eternal. A mountain can be stripped away layer by layer. There is great pride in the operation, making short work of geological truth. No man is a mountain, but men can wear one away. We assert our significance through these acts. These miracles of capital scrape away what thousands of years have made our diggers in trucks and men in hard hats, our remakers of nature and things. Geological time is revealed and pliable. We take what is sweet for the earth. We flatten and invert. We load our dump trucks one at a time. Buckets and buckets, we carry them away. We revise habitat. We change the geometry of the earth. We make electricity of our violations. We want what we want, and we get it when we want.
The moral of the story is, where there's smoke, there's mirrors.
That winter, thousands of birds fell from the sky. In Arkansas, the small corpses of 5,000 red-winged blackbirds and starlings suddenly rained down on the highways and in the public parks. Joggers stumbled, removing their headphones and staring in shock and awe. An elderly woman walking her dog was struck in the head by a brown-headed cowbird as her St. Bernard howled and strained at the leash. In Faenza, Italy, 8,000 turtle doves hailed down on the town like macabre Christmas ornaments, also strange at sea. In the Chesapeake Bay, millions of silverfish washed ashore. Near Kent, 40,000 devil crabs littered the beaches. Some blamed global warming, or God, or coincidence. Explanations were provided, but they only functioned to deepen the mystery and our sense of its enormity. A body wears a body down. In Venice Beach, he watches as a young woman endures a fresh tattoo on her upper arm, an exhibit in the body artist's display window. She grips something tightly in her hand. The needle gun, a loud, buzzing electric rattle. The tattooist spreads her flesh between fingers and thumb as he works. Palpable pain reflects through the window, her eyes rolling back slightly and her head an angle askew, jaw set in a kind of grim mortise, low moans escaping from time to time, droplets of blood forming along the lines. He stands close to the window and watches. Her thighs shudder slightly and her feet strain, as if she might bolt from the chair at any time, sweat streaming down her brow. He cannot look away, although he has stood here staring at the spectacle longer than could possibly be polite. He thinks for a moment that he might turn around, walk past the bodybuilders on the shore, and wade into the ocean, perhaps to swim out beyond. But he cannot move from this place at the window, in communion with her pain and its proximity to what strangely resembles ecstasy.
The moral of the story is, birds of a feather get the grease.
Okay, so that gave you kind of a quick impression of how it works. It was interesting. I thought the first one actually functioned pretty well with the juxtaposition of images and text. One of the things that's been interesting about that project, where the images and the text aren't yoked together until the program puts them together, is that sometimes the system actually produces things that make sense naturally. Other times, we have this capacity for closure, where whenever we hear something and see an image together, we attempt to make some coherence of it and create a kind of a narrative that brings them together. So that's interesting for that. I want to show you Toxicity. We might go just a little bit over time if I, like 10 minutes, would that be okay? Or would that, I won't be offended if you leave. So
We probably want to give some time for questions too.
yeah, okay, well, I'll show just, I'll stop it in the middle, so. But it sort of runs about 40 minutes. It's a slightly different system in that the text and the text and the images are put together in advance. What the algorithm's actually doing is structuring it differently, so that you're going to hear different characters' stories each time. But there's two layers to this. One is a narrative of a near future in which many hurricanes have hit the East Coast in rapid succession. and hit the Delaware River estuary, which is one of the oldest shipping corridors, industrial areas in the country, and also a place that has the most Superfund sites. And the project actually started with research that Rod did with his students, where they did a chemical map of the Delaware River, where they basically tracked out all of the Superfund sites, all of the industrial polluters, and basically all the toxic waste sites on the Delaware River. And they did some interviews with longshoremen and things like that. But then we got invited by the Chemical Heritage Foundation Museum. It's a very strange museum in Philadelphia that was originally funded by Dow Chemical, but it's an independent entity, and they were doing an exhibition called Sensing Change, which was art about climate change, but that art that was based on some sort of scientific research and extrapolated from that. So we sort of talked about this, and right at the time we started working on it was when Hurricane Sandy hit. And I remember I was in a conference in Edinburgh, and I got the newspaper at my hotel and looked at the front page, and I saw this picture of President Obama standing on this devastated shoreline. And I looked at the picture, did a double take, because where he was standing was actually 2 blocks from where I had lived before I moved from New Jersey to Norway. So the house that I had lived in was part of the rubble behind it. And I sort of thought we could integrate a layer of sort of true narratives of people who died in Hurricane Sandy. So I went through this very depressing process of sort of researching the death stories of all the people who died during the hurricane in New Jersey. And you know, the reasoning for that, I think, was that what we were trying to bring out was sort of the idea of the singularity of lives, that we process these incidents so fast, and we sort of move on very quickly. And you know, sort of this idea of hyper objects, these things that that we don't really have the capacity to process over time. And so what we're sort of trying to do is kind of bring that out in a film about climate change. So the repetition and the death, there's more death stories than you could possibly ever encounter in one screening of this work. And that's part of how we use the Combinatory. Make sure we can. We'll show this for each one of these.
I was proud of the way we handled the first big storms. I'd say we did pretty well. A lot of people died. A lot of people. It was a catastrophic event. But we could have had many, many more fatalities if we hadn't rehearsed and coordinated and had such a great communication system in place. Then the sequesters came. You know, we had to cut 5% in 2013. That might not sound like much, but it was $1 billion haircut. Staff, services, supplies, trailers, blankets. And then we had 4 hurricanes in a row. All the problems with the chemical plants and water treatment facilities, all the toxins that leached up into the water supply, the meltdown in New Jersey, it hit everything, flooded every part of the system. We had every agency, from the National Guard to the Army Corps of Engineers to the NRC to OSHA to the FERC, Port Authority, Homeland on down. Everybody trying to coordinate relief and reconstruction. Just as soon as we had one situation stabilized, we'd have another event. And what did Congress do? Once we'd blown past the year's budget, they called us to the carpet. Then they cut the budgets again in 15, 16, and 17. It's the death of logical thinking.
I remember when it all began, at least when it really started to get worse. I was just a kid when the big floods started. There had always been flooding, of course, but not the big ones that take out roads and rewrite shorelines. When the real storms started coming, all of them hurricanes, one after the other, all these places that had never flooded before were getting hit. I used to spend a lot of time down in the basement. Money was tight in the recession, and sometimes Mom and Dad would argue, and it seemed like a safe place. I remember one night I was down there painting scenes of things like I sometimes did, listening to the rain, and the walls cracked. The foundation fractured and the water seeped through. The water had a strange smell to it, and it got worse and worse over time. There was a lot of mopping. Finally, the walls and floors came off kilter, and tiles and things came off, floorboards coming off and stuff. By the time the inspector said we had to move, the house itself was at a strange angle, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa or something.
What I remember most is the birds. The fish kills, they happen every now and again, sometimes for natural causes, and it doesn't bother you much other than the smell, the stink of rotten fish. Something leaks out or they eat some bad algae, whatever, you know, fish die is part of life on the river. Sometimes you steer your way through a nasty patch of floaters, bullhead, catfish, striped bass, white perch, gizzard, shad, kills you to see a good eating fish oiled up like that. But the birds, the Canadian geese flying over this time of year, the feathers soak up the oil, and they look pathetic in the water. The geese and the ducks flapping around like that. The ones that make it to the shore try to run around and shake it off, but they're like half blind. They try to clean themselves and they end up eating that sludge. It's really pitiful. They try to fly and they can't anymore. Thousands of them. And Philadelphia International is right there, you know. So it was kind of ironic watching it. The planes kept taking off and landing, but the birds couldn't get off the ground.
The pigs are valuable. People out there are hungry. And we take turns keeping watch. We're near the river. Sometimes the food will come up from the shoreline. I never want to pull the trigger, but sometimes you have to squeeze off a warning shot. And you see the strangest things. A couple nights ago, I was sitting on the porch, enjoying a tall boy while keeping watch with my night vision goggles, when I see this teenage kid and some old lady out near the perimeter lugging duffel bags and looking hungry near the fence. I took aim and was near ready to fire if they took one more step near that fence. But they kept going, right up the shoreline. And what do you know, they kept on going. A boat met them and they headed across the river towards Camden, back to the wash. People do the damnedest things.
What you get up on the shoreline looks a lot like fresh blacktop, a thick layer of asphalt. Looks like somebody decided to build a highway underwater, and the shoreline is like the shoulder of that highway that you can't see. And the seawall, at low tide, it's like somebody came along and dipped it in black paint. And the tar balls, those will be floating around in the river for years. They gum things up, you know? They had to shut down the water intake for a couple of weeks, and the nuclear power plant too. It's no small thing. But still, you know, the river is amazing. The estuary cleans itself, eventually. Crabs and oysters from here is still good to eat. They tested them, and they were fine for eating.
Thomas loved nature and riding over the woods in hot air balloons. He liked to go for long hikes, and he knew which plants could be used to make tea or to salve wounds. One time he made a friend a bar of jewel weed soap. He was using a chainsaw the day after the storm, and suffered severe head trauma when the saw kicked back on an unstable limb that fell on him. He died the next day of complications from his injuries.
There are things in the wash that scare me. There are dogs and coyotes, but worst of all are the boars, and they'll eat anything. They'll eat corpses if they find them on the riverbanks or in the ruins of houses. In a way, it's beautiful that all of these animals are getting a new home, but still, they frighten me when I'm alone.
You know how they say doctors have a certain bedside manner? On this job, you develop a sort of graveside manner. We try to get all the survivors the hell off a site as soon as we possibly can, but people never want to leave their homes, their properties, their families, their memories. And they are in a lot of pain. And you feel that pain in a real, palpable way. And honestly, you want it out of your sight. I see their faces. I wake up feeling cold.
Joseph, a retired salesman for Accurate Precision Fasteners, drowned in South Hackensack while on a coffee run to Dunkin' Donuts. His modest brick home was bone dry, so he thought it was safe to go out. He apparently thought the floodwaters were shallow and drove his 2002 Mazda into them. As the water flooded the car, he attempted to escape through the driver's side window, and he was carried off in the floodwaters. His body was found some miles from there, next to the shore of the Hackensack River.
The Pentagon takes some of our advice, but more often, they ignore it. It's a different situation now. FEMA used to be about helping people see their way through, about helping people rebuild. But with so many places wiped out and so many people suffering, FEMA can't help much. In the new regime, we're all about taking out the garbage, clearing the debris, sealing things off. The military deals with keeping order and restoring basic infrastructure. We coordinate the cleanup, we bulldoze the buildings, we get the bodies in body bags and ship them off to the morgue. We send teeth to the forensic dentists. Sometimes the teeth are all we have to send. Sometimes we needed to take a mobile crematorium on site to dispose of the contaminated cadavers. Those remains won't take care of themselves. They pose serious health risks. It's all about containment.
The snakehead fish come up out of the marsh waters and crawl across the land. Those fish bite. And there may be some kind of sign. Their mouths are full of dagger teeth and they can squirm across the mud. Some can weigh 30, 40 pounds. They'll clean out just about any pond they find until there's nothing else left. And they'll bite humans too if you've not got boots on. They aren't bad to eat, but they aren't sweet like trout used to be. And they are nasty, ugly fish. I'm not complaining, but it bothers me some that all we got left are the nastiest fish, and that it's the meanest fish that survive when everything else goes to pot. It's the type that kill everything in their path that live the longest. I fear everything is dying, and every place is lost for it.
George was an unsuccessful painter and sculptor born in Hungary during the middle of the last century, and his brother remembers that the Danube flooded over its banks each spring near where they lived, and that both boys were terrified by the power of the water. He couldn't understand why George nevertheless chose to live in a little bungalow that sits alongside the lagoon in Brick Township. George didn't drive and he rarely left home. Neighbors said he lived like a hermit. During the storm surge, the floodwaters washed through the bungalow and George drowned.
I worked at the Walmart for a while when my mother was in hospice. It was good to have a job. It helped us pay for food and supplies. We were lucky because my father's life insurance paid out before things got really bad, so Mom and I had a little bungalow pretty much paid off. But you still need to pay for food and water and electricity. I I didn't really like the job at Walmart, but it was nice to be around people. And places like that are important. Stores where things still work more or less like they used to, where the products are familiar and the shelves are still stocked. Then I got fired when I let one of the shoplifters escape before the police got there. She was a lady from our neighborhood, and I knew she had a little 3-year-old at home to feed. All she had taken were a few bags of oatmeal and some cans of corned beef, and I didn't think she should go to jail for that. I left the back door open while the security guard was out having a smoke, but they caught me on one of those cameras and sent me home that afternoon.
We've got to grow our own food and harvest our own meat. And we can do that. I used to make my living in the insurance industry. When the company I worked for went belly up after the first big wave of storms and gave me my walking papers, you think I threw up my hands and gave up? Hell no. This is America. Show me a crisis, I'll show you an opportunity. And most of my neighbors moved out after the flooding. This block looked like a ghetto. I could have cut and run. Could have whined about my property values and all the crime and everything. But I decided to stay right here. This is my neighborhood. I didn't know the first thing about pig farming 5 years ago. But after the meat crisis, I said to myself, there's one thing people need now. It's good, clean, pure American meat.
Stop there. Give a little time for questions. So, so it actually does have an ending. But the ending will be the same every time it runs. But you'll hear about 60 or 70% of the narrative stories each time, so they'll be, like in this one, we heard more from female worker and pig farmer, and less from a couple of the other characters. And then the death stories will be intersected differently. So there's the structure. So there's a beginning sequence that's slightly variable. It's kind of one of 3 things that happen. And then there's this cycle iterates where there's 2 stories and death chorus. Then there's moving back to the interlude. That happens twice, and then you get to an ending. So it works pretty well. We've mainly shown it in sort of screenings, but also installation contexts. And there it works pretty well in sort of galleries where people can come back and see a completely different version of the film. I always get questions because we show it for like 45 minutes at this sort of event, and then people are like, well, how do we know that? That because you don't see it on one run through. Yeah, so that's
cool. Thanks. Let's applause and questions. I have a bunch of questions. I'll start us off maybe. So this morning I called my car company and they had this voice machine, the voice telephone machine, and it told me things like, did you know that the Earth now has 1 billion vehicles driving around every day? And I'm like, that is kind of surreal that they would tell me that. I don't like that. 1 billion vehicles sounds like enough. I'm just going to return my car right there. But so what I was thinking is also about fake news and about how the systems you generate are eerily close to telephone machines and fake news, but they're completely different in terms of the value. But the ethos is almost similar. Are there moments where those wires get crossed, where the tools and the intent purposes sort of stop being separate?
all right. I'm trying to.
Because they're the same algorithms in principle that keep people entertained and
sort of service them or service the corporation's desire to roboticize
Yeah,
our
but it's
lives.
like, look, no human. Let's put all the pieces together and let it
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, it's more, you know, and even, you know, a lot of these poetry generators, they're not, and really most algorithmic systems, they're not unauthored, right? So they're not, it's not that human writers are not involved.
No, it's beautiful. Yeah,
It's
we can
just
see
a-
that. Yeah.
It's a different outcome than producing a static artwork for the page or for a wall. But I think, yeah, I mean, there have been some funny works that do that sort of. So there's chatbots, for example, works of electronic literature that actually use the. Mark Marino's done a couple that use the phone tree systems.
That's it.
In a sort of satirical manner. But I mean, I think they are, you know, they're different projects, but there's a lot of sort of interesting / scary work being done too. For instance, poetry generators that are based on neural networks. A guy, Jave Johnston, a writer, has now switched to, you know, and neural network systems, you don't really know how the program's running, right? So you don't, you know, Facebook and Amazon have black box systems that anyone can use, but they're black boxed. So you don't really know what the program's going to do or how it runs. You train it. You give it texts and you change a few. You configure, you change some knobs, and then it outputs stuff. So Jave took, I think, poets.org and the Pen Sound Archive, and fed you know, I forget how many thousands of poems, but into a neural network and tweaked it a little bit. But now every morning he gets about 100 pages of poetry from the neural network. And an interesting project is he's putting out a book of poetry a month. So what he does every morning is he selects out stanzas that he likes from the, so he's actually editing it, and there's a process of writing involved. But he's basically taking these machine-written poems and just, you know, deleting a lot of stuff and just kind of, here's a new poem, you know. And they're pretty interesting, you know, convincing poems, but it's a completely different sort of process, and that the authoring is, you know, not done. That's much more non-human authoring.
Who's this again, please?
David Jave Johnston, Jhave.
Jhave?
Yeah. And project's called Big Data Poetry, BDP.
I was wondering, because specifically the toxicity and other recombinatory, like, visual poetics that you're doing seems similar, like, kind of in the same vein as that question, as there was a recent article in Medium by James Bridle talking about how, like, young children's videos are being, like selected through views in a recombinatory manner in a way that's kind of really troubling and unethical. So I was wondering if you would speak to the ethics of your project, kind of opening up an ethical space. Do you see that your project is disruptive of that ethics of capitalism, maybe, or do you see it as being sort of co-opted by capitalism?
So that's it. I just read that article yesterday, because Jill, my wife, decided to delete kids' YouTube from all our tablets after she read that. Yeah, I hope so. I mean, a couple of projects. This one, and Hearts and Minds. It's a project about prisoner torture. You do sort of hope that they actually have some kind of impact. And, you know, for me, it's been really rewarding with this project and that project that they've gotten into other forums than the ones I usually show work in. So, you know, this has been shown at environmental conferences. I'm not sure if you change minds there because everyone's already sort of convinced, but it is a work that provokes conversation, and certainly Hearts and Minds has been shown at things like, and that's I'll talk about that in your class on Monday. But that's a project that's based on interviews with soldiers who tortured people in Iraq. And that's been shown at things like human rights events where there were actually people in the audience who've been tortured. And that, that's really rewarding in a different way because it actually, hopefully has some effect or at least provokes conversation about issues that remain, important and remain unresolved. And I think, I sort of come back to that with toxicity, that sort of, this, Timothy Morton's idea of the hyper-object, things like climate change, that we sort of see it every day, but we can't really, it's very difficult for us to process it, to add all the events together and to translate that into, some changes in our economy and things like that. So yeah, I hope it's a disruption at the same time as I know that any narrative artwork, any poetic artwork, the effects that any of these artworks have are going to be very limited. It's just a drop, but hopefully enough drops and enough buckets over time.
As you shifted from the poetry to the video, I'm just curious about the temporal nature or the time space, and how in the poetry it seems like this condensed space means that there's a lot of experimentation and you're observing kind of what's happening as it's happening, and then you're kind of potentially intervening, whereas this video is the temporal nature of it, the length of it, makes it so that, as you yourself was, you were saying, like, your mind kind of like arrives at its own conclusions or kind of wants its own resolutions. And so do you find, I guess, between the two, did you find, what was that experiment like, the comparison between the two? For me, it seems like that the poetry is like a very intense and explicit and clear what you're kind of getting from that, from opening that black box and starting to kind of play with them. Whereas with the video, it seems as though, I don't know that you're accomplishing the same thing, but maybe there's another kind of, you're gaining more distance from the work and sort of giving more ownership to the viewer. I don't know, I'm just curious about those two spaces, especially in terms of time.
Yeah, I mean, there's much more sort of kind of conventional narrative interpretive time involved with the film stuff. And, the processes are completely different, of course, in that, this, like Toxicity involved, Rod and I work together a lot, but we bring in a lot of other people. So the number of people eventually involved in Toxicity was, a dozen or so. And just in terms of the time to develop films, it takes a much longer time to just do the work as well. So I think, the other thing I think though is the poetry is, neither of those were actually narrative. I mean, I usually do work in narrative. So narrative has a different effect or affect. And film has a different affect. So there's much more, interpretive interaction, and both of those sort of ideally seen are just under an hour too. So there's more of a, you get more involved emotionally or reactionally. You have a different opinion. You really have an opinion at the end of it, whether it's positive or ill. So, yeah.
I have a question. Are you familiar with Jeff Berg's work, Search for a Global Song? Okay. It's, God, I was working on it like 3 years ago. I don't know if it's still going on. But UCLA Remap, which is the Center for Research in Entertainment, Media, and Performance, art. I'm forgetting. But at the time we were working on this algorithmically cut together film where the script was set, but then we asked multiple directors to each film each scene, and then we would splice them together and then play it. And how it worked was it had 3 generations of characters who were all living their own lives in very close proximity to each other, and then were connected. So
Search for a Global Song.
Search for a Global Song, Jeff Berg.
That sounds really interesting.
It's a beautiful piece, and you might see me in the background as an extra. I had to work a lot on that. But it was like, you were just saying that there's like a different affect that comes from narrative and a different affect that comes from film. So I was just wondering if you had potentially like experimented with like having the narrative be fixed, but like the film pieces be different and have all of like these different like perspectives that are coming in and that are being algorithmically generated and re-stitched together.
I mean, there's some visual, like in Toxi City, there's a few places where visual sequences can be different with the same material, but no, we haven't certainly done it like that, where there's different directors on the same scene. Sounds like a really interesting approach. And there's a ton of, I mean, we're doing other things, but the next couple of projects are going to be combinatory again. And I sort of made a huge laundry list of things that we could do with this technique, just in terms of that would be interesting to try. So the next one, I don't know if we'll ever actually have the combinatory version out, because we actually used live actors, so there was a different thing, and then and we shot it like in 2 weeks in Ireland and on a very low budget, so one of the actors was not great, so and then you're kind of stuck when you have the live actors.
Yeah.
Not that they were all great. I forgot. They were fantastic. But there we're actually experimenting with scenes of dialogue, where the dialogue is different on each one. I think that'll be really interesting. And then the other one that we will get out early next year is actually sort of on the lines of Quino, where it's a combinatory sonnet film. That we're doing a sort of series of things around the Odyssey, and this one writes a sonnet up to the 14th line and then unwrites it. But there's both the sonnet text, but then we have Rod, the filmmaker, on doing the writing, and then we're working with the composer as well. So there'll also be musical tracks that recombine underneath the film and the voice track. So there's tons of interesting things that I think could be done with this, and I don't always know that it's necessarily more interesting as a result of that. I mean, maybe Toxi City would be the same or better if it wasn't combinatory, but it is. I think all electronic literature is experimental literature, and part of the project of it is it is hopefully we create these meaningful aesthetic works of art and artifacts, but it's also we're trying things out that maybe haven't been tried before, and seeing what works, and it's actually sort of they're experiments in the scientific sense as well as the artistic sense. So, and that's what makes it fun and exciting.